The warning came preloaded into every standard data packet shipped with the Vorathi survey fleet. Most species received it as a formality. A 23-line bureaucratic document translated into 46,000 galactic dialects, filed under subsection 9.4 of the Interstellar Biological Hazard Registry, stamped with a classification nobody had bothered to update since the registry's founding 400 years prior. The classification read, DATHWRLD adjacent, severity, moderate, recommended approach posture, standard precautionary. Nobody read it. That was not unusual. The Death World adjacent classification covered approximately 11% of all surveyed biospheres in the known galaxy, worlds where gravity ran heavy, radiation indexes exceeded comfortable baselines, atmospheric chemistry leaned caustic, or biological fauna demonstrated what the registry politely called advanced competitive adaptation. Planets full of things with teeth and venom, and the evolutionary stubbornness of something that had never been permitted to lose. The classification was meant to trigger elevated caution protocols. Instead, it triggered nothing, because the form had been auto-filed for so long that no one in the fleet's xenological division had actual eyes on it anymore. Fleet Surveyor Tethkadaris received the packet for Sol III on the morning of third cycle, galactic date 7204.88. She skimmed it, set it down, poured herself a vapor infusion. The planet was blue and green, swirled with cloud cover, modest in size, unremarkable in position. Oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, liquid water surface covering approximately 71%, single moon, G-class star, comfortable luminosity. Gravity at 1.02 galactic standard, barely worth noting. She stamped the approach clearance. She did not read past the first page. This was how first contact with humanity began, with a bureaucratic shrug. My name is Sergeant First Class Dara Osai Mensa, and I want to be clear about something before I tell you any of this. I was not supposed to be the one who was there. I was covering a rotation for Corporal Yetund, who had a sister getting married in Lagos that weekend. I had just come off a 12-hour maintenance shift on the relay array at the edge of the base perimeter. I smelled like thermal grease and bad coffee. My boot had a split along the left heel that I had been meaning to fix for 6 days. When the lights came down from the sky, I was the only person awake on the north side of the base. I've told this story many times now, to generals, to the UN panel, to a room of very serious people in Geneva who kept asking me to repeat the part about the communication device. I've told it so many times that I've learned which parts make people lean forward and which parts make their eyes go flat with disbelief. The part that always makes them go flat is the beginning. The part where it was just me, and a sky full of lights, and a device the size of a dinner plate that landed in the red Georgia clay like it had been placed there by a very careful hand. I didn't run. I want to be clear about that too. I stood there in my split-heeled boot and I watched it come down and I thought, well, here we are. That's the thing about growing up in a world that tried to kill you a little every day. At a certain point, you stop flinching. The Vorathi survey fleet had been in operation for 417 years. In that time, they had cataloged 1,236 inhabited biospheres. Of those, they had encountered 62 species that met the minimum threshold for what the fleet called reciprocal communication capability, meaning the species could, in theory, be taught to respond to standardized contact protocols in under a generation's time. Most species, when contacted, demonstrated one of 3 predictable response sets. The first, awe, total, prostrate, reverential awe. These species, often the ones whose worlds were gentle, whose evolutionary pressures had been mild, received the Vorathi with something approaching religious ecstasy. They asked no difficult questions. They signed every offered agreement. They became extremely easy trade partners and extremely boring anthropological case files. The second, fear, panic, biological threat response. The Vorathi had learned over centuries of practice how to manage this. You moved slowly. You used low-frequency sound emissions. You allowed the frightened species to set the pace of contact. It was time-consuming but predictable. The third, cautious curiosity. The in-between species. They were alert, watchful, prone to forming committees and deliberating at length before acting. They wanted to understand before they committed. The Vorathi found these species mildly engaging. They took longer, but they produced richer data. No survey protocol existed for the fourth response type. Because, in 417 years of operation, the fleet had never encountered it. The fourth response type was assessment. Not fear, not awe, not cautious curiosity. Genuine, calibrated, methodical assessment. The kind you perform when you have spent your entire evolutionary history on a world that was trying to eat you, and you have survived anyway. And the skill that got you through is the ability to look at a thing that could kill you and immediately begin calculating how to deal with it. Survey Unit 7. The small automated probe the fleet had deployed to Sol III's surface transmitted its first contact data back to Fleet Surveyor Tethkadaris at 3:47 Galactic Standard Time. The first thing the human did when the probe landed was approach it. She did not run. She did not fall to her knees. She did not back away. She walked toward it from a distance of approximately 40 meters, maintaining eye contact, which the unit's sensors flagged correctly as a dominance behavior, and she stopped at a distance of roughly 2.5 meters. She tilted her head. She looked at the probe for a long time. The probe's biological monitoring suite recorded elevated cortisol, moderate adrenaline, heart rate at 114 beats per minute. Not panic, readiness. Then she said something the translator unit had to work through 3 separate cultural matrices to approximate. The rough equivalent came out as, "Okay, so, what do you need?" Tethkadaris replayed that transmission 4 times. She set down her vapor infusion. She picked up the Death World adjacent classification and read it, all 23 lines, for the first time. She sent an urgent request for consultation to Fleet Command. Fleet Command, being Fleet Command, took 6 days to respond. I'm going to tell you what it felt like, standing in front of that thing, because I think the feeling matters and nobody ever asks about the feeling. It was about the size of a large slow cooker, dark metal casing, smooth seams, no visible joints. The landing had raised almost no dust. It had come down with a precision that made me understand it had been designed by something that understood precision the way surgeons understand it. There were 2 small apertures on the front face that I understood somehow to be cameras, or the equivalent. There was a faint hum coming from inside it, the kind of hum that means active processing, not sleep. I had grown up with machines my whole life. My mother was a mechanical engineer. My grandmother used to talk about how the appliances in her village, when they finally got them in the 90s, seemed almost alive to her. How she had spoken to the refrigerator, genuinely, the way you speak to something that is sharing your space and deserves acknowledgement. I had grown up thinking she was being poetic. Standing in front of this thing at 3 in the morning in the Georgia clay, I thought, Grandma knew something I didn't. The thing wasn't alive, I knew that, but it was present. There's a difference between something that is off and something that is attending. This was attending. I crouched down, so we were at the same level. Can you understand me? I said. Nothing happened for about 15 seconds. I was very aware of the weight of my sidearm. I did not reach for it. That felt like it would be the wrong answer to a question that hadn't been asked yet. Then a sound came out of the device. Not words. Something between a tone and a texture, structured, rhythmic, deliberate. My brain tried to pattern match it to Morse code, to music, to the clicking communication of certain insects I'd read about. It didn't fit any of them. It was its own thing. I listened to it for about 40 seconds. Then I said, I don't understand that, but I'm listening. Take your time. 22 more seconds of silence. Then the device played the tone again, shorter this time. Then stopped. Then played my own voice back at me, the words, "I don't understand that," with a slight modulation like a question at the end. I felt something move in my chest, not fear, something almost like recognition. "Yeah," I said, "exactly." Fleet Command's response arrived on day 6 and contained 3 things. A mandate to continue standard contact protocol, a reminder that the Death World adjacent classification was a moderate flag and not a severe one, and a note that Survey Unit 7's biological monitors were malfunctioning and should be recalibrated, because the cortisol and adrenaline readings for the contact subject were far outside normal parameters for an initial contact scenario. Tethkadaris read the note about the biological monitors and felt something she had not felt in many years of survey work. She felt it the way you feel the hum of a reactor you cannot see, a low-frequency certainty that something in the room is running, and running differently than the manual says it should. The monitors were not malfunctioning. She had been a fleet surveyor for 30 years. She had run initial contact protocols on 9 separate species. She knew the biological signatures of a frightened organism, and she knew the biological signatures of a combat-ready organism, and she knew, intimately, the particular signature of a species experiencing what the fleet's psychological division categorized as threat overwhelm, the flooding of the body's alarm system in response to contact with technology, sufficiently advanced that it outstripped the organism's capacity for immediate comprehension. What the biological monitors on Survey Unit 7 were reading did not match any of those signatures. What they were reading was consistent with what the fleet's database categorized, in a very old section of the xenobiology archives that Tethkadaris had to dig through 3 levels of deprecated documentation to find, as enhanced cognitive engagement. The physiological state of an organism actively solving a problem, not panicking, not freezing, working. She pulled the full biological timeline from Unit 7's sensor log. In the 11 minutes between the unit's landing and the human's first approach, the cortisol and adrenaline had spiked sharply, threat response, normal, and then, instead of sustaining at high levels or declining as the organism retreated, they had dropped to a controlled plateau. Not calm, ready. The way a surgeon's hand stops shaking the moment the procedure begins. The body deciding that this was not the time to be afraid, because being afraid was less useful than being precise. Tethkadaris had never seen that pattern in an initial contact scenario. In 30 years, 9 contact events, 1,236 cataloged worlds. She had never seen it. She spent the next 3 days running exhaustive background analysis on the planet's biosphere using the fleet's long-range atmospheric and geological scanners. She pulled historical records, not the bureaucratic file, but raw astronomical data going back millions of years. She built a picture of Sol III in geological time, layer by layer, and what she found, she could not stop looking at the way you cannot stop looking at something that reframes everything you thought you understood. What she found was this: 90% of all species that had ever existed on this planet were extinct. The extinction events were multiple, overlapping, catastrophic, volcanic superevents, asteroid impacts, oxygen catastrophes that had rewritten the atmospheric composition of the entire planet in geological blinks. Each of these events should have ended the biosphere, should have ended the progression of complex life entirely. On any of the other 11,000 surveyed worlds in the fleet's database, events of this magnitude had produced exactly that result: a biosphere reset, a returning to simple forms, a beginning again. On Sol III, the biosphere had not reset. It had adapted and accelerated. The species that survived each extinction event were the ones that were, by any measurable standard, too stubborn to disappear. The survivors did not survive because they were protected or shielded, or because fortune had placed them in a favorable geographic position. They survived because something in their cellular structure, their behavioral pattern, their fundamental biology had refused the option of extinction and improvised an alternative. And then that alternative had become the baseline, and the next extinction event had been survived by something even more obstinate, and so on, compounding across hundreds of millions of years, until the planet was populated almost exclusively by the most aggressively survivable lineages that chemistry and evolution could produce. For hundreds of millions of years, this planet had been running a continuous elimination tournament. Every generation of every species had been under constant, multi-directional pressure to either adapt or disappear. The biosphere itself, its predation dynamics, its weather systems, its geological activity, had functioned as the most rigorous selection mechanism Tethkadaris had ever seen in a life-bearing world's fossil record. Not just selecting for intelligence, or for social cooperation, or for tool use, or for communication. Selecting for all of those simultaneously, under conditions where failure meant extinction, and selecting with a pressure that had never fully relented. The species that was now building cities and radio arrays and interstellar detectable electromagnetic signatures had won that tournament, not gracefully, not in one continuous line of elegant development. The fossil record showed die-offs, bottlenecks, population crashes that should have been endpoints. Near-extinction events in this particular species' primate lineage alone numbered in the dozens across the geological record. Near, not complete. Tethkadaris found, deep in the geological strata, evidence of a population crash in this species' recent evolutionary history. The genetic record suggested that, at one point, the entire global breeding population of this sapient species had dropped to something in the range of a few thousand individuals. The species that now numbered in the billions had once come within statistical whisper of ending entirely. And had not ended. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about the biological readout from Survey Unit 7, the controlled plateau, the precision under pressure. This was not a new behavior. This was an ancient behavior. This was a behavior that was old enough to have survived the population crash. To have been the thing that allowed a few thousand individuals, under conditions that should have been an ending, to become a few million, and then a few 100 million, and then 8 billion. She pulled up the Death World adjacent classification again. Read the criteria for severe status. The note read, worlds where primary sapient species demonstrates advanced survival adaptation due to prolonged multi-extinction level pressure events. She looked at the data spread across her workstation. She changed the classification herself. She knew she wasn't authorized to do that. The authorization chain for a hazard reclassification required sign-off from 3 senior fleet administrators, a xenobiological review panel, and a fleet command delegate. The process took, on average, 4 months. She changed it anyway. She had a feeling that 4 months might be longer than they had. She flagged it severe. She sent Fleet Command a second communication, more urgent than the first. She titled it, Contact Subject is not frightened. Recommend immediate review of engagement protocols. Fleet Command did not respond for 12 more days. By then, Sergeant First Class Dara Osimensa had learned to communicate in the Vorathi tonal language well enough to hold a basic conversation. I want to tell you about the dog. His name was Biscuit, 11 years old. He belonged to a family that lived on base, the Hendersons, whose quarters were about 90 meters from the north perimeter where I was running my rotation. Biscuit was what I can only describe as a deeply experienced animal. He had seen things in his 11 years. He had opinions. He was not easily impressed. The first time he saw the probe, he walked up to it and sniffed it for a long time, the way dogs examine anything new, methodical, and serious. And then he looked at me, looked back at the probe, and sat down beside it. Just sat down, like he'd made a decision. The probe's cameras tracked him. I've thought about that a lot in the years since. The cameras tracked him. Whatever was running, that machine took note of Biscuit and adjusted. Because after that, when I came to the probe for what I had started calling my sessions, the hours I spent trying to communicate, trying to learn its language, trying to build something between us out of tone and silence and patience, it always acknowledged him first. A brief sound directed at Biscuit, not the communication attempts it made with me. Something else. Simpler. A low, steady tone like breathing. Biscuit would wag once slowly and settle down. There is something about being acknowledged by an unknown intelligence that unmakes you a little and remakes you differently. Not because of what it says, because of what it demonstrates that something, out there in the vast and indifferent dark, noticed you, filed you, made a specific sound for you, out of all the possible sounds it could make. I don't cry easily. I'm telling you that I came close. Some of those mornings, watching a machine from another star say hello to a golden retriever. The Vorathi fleet had a specific protocol for communicating the discovery of a new sapient species to the Galactic Accord. The protocol involved documentation, filing, review, counter-review, formal presentation, and then, if all parties agreed, an official declaration of first contact, which triggered a cascade of diplomatic, scientific, and commercial procedures that could occupy fleets for decades. Tethkadaris followed none of it. What she did instead was this. She retasked Survey Unit 7 from observation mode to active communication mode. She began the contact sequence herself, directly, without waiting for authorizations she was increasingly certain would arrive too late to matter. She spent 16-hour days analyzing every communication the human transmitted, building vocabulary tables, isolating phonemic units, mapping the grammar structures of what she was starting to understand was a language that had dozens of regional variants, historical layers, and deliberate ambiguities. A language built not for precision but for negotiation. She found that extraordinary. Every Vorathi language she knew was optimized for clarity, precision, the removal of ambiguity. The human's language, the one she'd isolated from the contact subject's transmissions and run against every linguistic database the fleet carried, was built around ambiguity, around the space between what was said and what was meant. The language was a tool not for conveying information but for navigating relationships. She wrote this in her personal log. A species that builds its primary communication tool around the management of uncertainty has probably spent most of its history in uncertainty. She looked at the extinction data again. She wrote, "They are not primitive, they are seasoned." On day 19, Survey Unit 7 transmitted a visual recording that made Tethkadaris sit very still for a long time. The human had brought a second creature. A large quadruped, warm-blooded, golden-coated, with what biological analysis identified as a highly developed olfactory system and a brain structure wired for social bonding. The quadruped was old, cellular degradation patterns consistent with advanced age for its species. The human sat cross-legged on the ground beside the probe. She put her hand on the old quadruped's back. The quadruped leaned into her. They sat together in the pre-dawn dark, not speaking, both of them attending to the probe. Tethkadaris had surveyed 1,200 planets. She had observed species engaged in tool use, language, agriculture, warfare, art, architecture, and mathematics. She had seen intelligence manifest in every configuration her imagination and her instruments could register. She had never seen anything sit the way this human sat. The stillness of it, the ease, as if the creature beside her was not a different species but a companion she'd known for years, and the strange machine from another star was simply a neighbor they were getting acquainted with together at their own pace. She keyed up the unit's response protocol. For the first time in the survey mission, she spoke personally into the transmission feed, not the auto-generated contact sequence. Her own voice, modulated through the unit's translation system. She said in approximated human phonemes, "We did not expect you to be patient." A long silence from the contact subject. Then, "Most things worth anything take time." The report that eventually reached Fleet Command, 26 days into a contact mission that should have been resolved in 48 hours, caused what could only be described as institutional distress. The survey fleet had protocols for every scenario, for species that attacked on first contact, for species that worshipped first contact, for species that were pre-linguistic, post-linguistic, hive-minded, individually bounded, aquatic, gaseous, crystalline. The protocols had been refined over 4 centuries, and they were comprehensive. None of them covered this. The contact subject had not been contained, pacified, or overwhelmed with the standard display of technological superiority that the fleet used to establish authority in new contact situations. She had not been impressed into submission by the sight of Vorathi technology. She had studied it. She had analyzed it. She had, and this was the line in Tethkadaris's report that Fleet Command made her repeat 3 times. She had started reverse engineering the unit's communication protocols from the outside, using nothing but sustained attention and pattern recognition within the first 4 days of contact. Fleet Command sent a new directive: deploy additional survey units to different geographic locations. Assess whether the contact subject's behavior was anomalous within the species or representative. Tethkadaris deployed 14 additional units across 9 geographic zones on 3 continents. She got her answer within 72 hours. The contact responses varied by region, by individual, by social context. Some humans ran from the units. Some attacked them. Some tried to communicate. Some tried to dissect. Some did both simultaneously. A subset immediately began broadcasting the unit's coordinates to other humans using their own communication networks. A subset of that subset arrived at the unit locations with what biological analysis identified as recording equipment, and in 3 cases, weapons. But universally, across every contact event in every geographic zone, one thing was consistent. Within 48 hours of first exposure, every contact subject had begun attempting to find the edge of the unit's capabilities. Not worshipping it, not fleeing it, testing it. The way you test a wall to find the door. The way you press on something to understand where it gives. Tethkadaris wrote in her log, "They are not assessing the technology. They are assessing us." I was the first. That's what they tell me now in retrospect. The first sustained contact, the first communication bridge, the first, and I cringe at the word, but it's accurate, the first human to be taken seriously by the Vorathi as a communication partner rather than a biological sample. I didn't know any of that at the time. I just knew that every morning at 3:30, give or take, I went to the North Perimeter and sat with Biscuit and learned something new. The language was hard. I won't pretend otherwise. My brain wasn't built for it. The tonal structures existed in frequency ranges my ears could barely parse and my mouth couldn't reproduce at all. The Vorathi language. I learned later that it was actually a simplified interface layer the probe was using, not the full deep register tonal language the species used amongst themselves, the way you might use simpler words with a child, or with someone you've just met and don't yet know the vocabulary of, was organized around sequences of overlapping tones that carried meaning not just in their pitch and duration, but in the intervals between them. The spaces were grammatical. The pauses were words. I borrowed equipment from the signals team. Not officially, I want to be clear, and set up a makeshift transceiver that let me work in a register my hardware could manage. I rerouted a spectrum analyzer from the electronic warfare bay, told Sergeant Kowalski I was running an atmospheric interference study, and did not meet his eyes when I said it. I spent nights transcribing recordings, mapping the frequency structures by hand because the automated analysis software kept trying to classify the signal as environmental noise, and I had to keep overriding it. I filled 4 notebooks, 3 with tonal mapping and 1, the last one almost entirely with vocabulary. Single words approximated into phonetic English, with notes about context and uncertainty in the margins. The uncertainty notes were the most important part of those notebooks, I think. They reminded me that I might be wrong. They kept me from assuming I understood before I did. The sessions had a shape to them. In the first week, the probe would transmit and I would respond, and it would adjust, always adjusting, always recalibrating, homing in on whatever register I was able to receive and replicate. It was patient in a way that did not feel mechanical. Whatever was running, it was genuinely attending to the process of being understood. On day 11, it began doing something I still find remarkable to think about. When I made an error, when I responded in a way that clearly misparsed what it had sent, it did not move on. It repeated the transmission, varied it slightly, waited, tried a different approximation. It was not correcting me from above. It was searching with me for the ground we could both stand on. On day 14, I realized the sessions had started feeling less like studying and more like conversation. Not because we were exchanging information exactly, but because there was a rhythm to it that felt mutual. It was reaching, I was reaching, and sometimes in the middle of that reaching something connected and we both knew it, and that knowing was its own kind of language above the language of tones. Biscuit slept most mornings, his head on my thigh, occasionally lifting it to follow a sound in the brush and then lowering it again. The probe always acknowledged him first. I had started to think of that as the opening of the session, the way you think of the handshake or the greeting at the start of a meeting. The acknowledgement that everyone present was present and that this mattered. By day 23, I could say, in something approaching Vorathi tonal structure, I am here, I am listening, I want to understand. 3 phrases. Rough, imprecise, probably with terrible tonal grammar in at least 2 of them. But mine, earned through 14 days of transcription notebooks and borrowed spectrum analyzers and mornings in the Georgia clay. The probe played the phrases back to me, then made a sound I had not heard before. My analyzer mapped it, and when I looked at the frequency structure, I recognized something that might have been a question mark. The upward pitch drift at the end that I'd started to associate with inquiry. I said in English because I didn't have the tonal vocabulary yet, "Yes, that was me," I said it. Silence for 10 seconds. Then it played my phrases back again, slightly differently, not a correction, more like a savoring, like turning a stone over in your hand. By day 26, Teth Kadaris, and it took me another week to understand that it was a specific individual speaking to me and not the machine itself, that there was a person on the other end making choices about how to respond, a person who had been watching these sessions and choosing to engage more personally, told me they had not expected patience. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about the way she had spoken to the refrigerator, not because she was naive, but because she knew that the world worked better when you extended acknowledgement to the things sharing your space. I thought about Biscuit, getting old, sitting beside me in the pre-dawn dark without needing to understand anything except that I was there, and that this time, like all the times before, was enough. I said, most things worth anything take time. And something shifted, in the quality of the silence on the other end, in the texture of what came after, something that I can only describe as a different quality of attending, a presence that had been professional and careful becoming something with a different weight. The way a room changes when someone in it decides they trust you. I had said the right thing, not because it was impressive, because it was true, and because it was the same truth on both sides of the language barrier, and those are the only truths that do any real work. Fleet Command's arrival changed everything, and not for the better. They came with 3 capital vessels and a delegation that numbered in the hundreds. They arrived with a full deployment of diplomatic protocol specialists, xenobiological survey teams, security divisions, and what Tethkadaris would later describe in her private log as an enormous amount of confidence in their own procedures. The fleet had already decided before their ships cleared the outer boundary of the Sol system what humanity was. The data had been reviewed. The classification updated to severe by Tethkadaris had been noted, filed, and Tethkadaris learned this later, from a colleague, specifically downgraded back to moderate by a senior fleet administrator who found the severity escalation overcautious. The reasoning: the Deathworld adjacent classification severe tier was reserved for species that posed active threat potential to fleet assets or personnel. Humanity, the fleet administration had concluded, was a pre-spaceflight species with conventional weapons, limited atmospheric capability, no electromagnetic shielding systems, and no defense assets beyond their own atmosphere. The planet was a prize: useful minerals, viable agricultural biosphere. A population that, properly managed, could become a labor resource of significant scale. Tethkadaris read the deployment orders and felt the low-frequency hum again, louder this time. She sent a message to the administration. It was 11 lines long. The most important line was the 6th. This species does not respond to demonstration of power the way other species do. Do not open with a demonstration of power. The administration did not respond. The fleet opened with a demonstration of power. I need you to understand the scale of what came over the horizon on day 31. I had grown up watching my mother calculate structural load tolerances, watching her build things that were supposed to hold. I had spent a career in the military surrounded by machines of war, and I had a working understanding of what technology looks like when it is deployed at maximum expression. I thought I knew what impressive looked like. I was wrong about what impressive looked like. 3 ships appeared in low orbit just after dawn, and they were each large enough that they were visible to the naked eye as distinct objects, not points of light, not satellites, but shapes. 3 discrete objects of enormous mass, hanging in the sky with the kind of casual precision that could only be achieved by technology that had ceased to find gravity particularly interesting. The morning light hit them differently than it hit clouds, differently than it hit anything I had a reference for. They were the color of cooled metal, and they did not move. The sky between them was crossed with what I could only describe as the infrastructure of something's confidence. Relay signals visible as faint luminescent threads, positioning drones moving in geometric patterns, sensor arrays that I could feel more than see, a pressure behind the eyes that I recognized from my signals training as active scanning at a frequency my brain was not designed to ignore. It was the scaffolding of a civilization that had never seriously considered that something down here might push back. That was what made it so large. Not the technology, the assumption built into the technology, the assumption of an answer that had already been decided. By 6:30, there were 3 people on the base who had figured out what they were looking at, and approximately 200 who were figuring it out. By 800, the base was under emergency protocol, and every communications line on the installation was either compromised or in use, usually both. By 900, I had been pulled from the perimeter by Colonel Adami's aide, and was sitting in a briefing room trying to explain, in plain English, everything I had learned about the Vorathi in 26 days, which felt inadequate in a way that is difficult to articulate without making me sound less competent than I like to think I am. Colonel Adami listened without interrupting for 45 minutes. Then he asked me 3 questions. The questions were: can you communicate with them effectively? Do they know that you can, and what do they want? I said yes, adequately, increasingly. I said, I believe so. And I said, I don't know yet, but the communication pattern of the past week has shifted. There's a different quality to it, like a conversation that's been preparation and is now becoming something else. I said, I think they're about to tell us. Colonel Adami nodded once. He said, stay close. They deployed a ground unit directly onto the base parade ground. Not a small probe, a ground unit, the size of a shipping container, arriving not with a crash but with a settling, the way a heavy door closes on well-maintained hinges, with a finality that is polite about its own authority. A ramp extended. What came down the ramp was, I am using this word carefully, a delegation. They were tall, not impossibly but uncomfortably, 8 feet, give or take, with a proportional mass and geometry that was close enough to bilateral symmetry that my brain kept trying to file them as human-shaped and failing at it. 4 limbs, a head structure with sensory organs arranged differently than ours but recognizable as serving similar purposes. The face of something that had also needed to see, to hear, to analyze. The exosuit they wore had the quality of something that had been engineered to be impressive. Visible power coupling along the shoulder lines, ambient illumination at a frequency that fell just outside comfortable human visual range, producing a faint peripheral glow that my eyes kept trying to resolve and couldn't. A low subsonic hum emanated from the suits themselves. I later learned from Tethkadaris that the hum was a deliberate design feature, a frequency calibrated through survey data from multiple contact events to produce a mild but measurable stress response in bilaterally symmetric oxygen-breathing species. It was, in effect, a tool for establishing dominance without overt aggression. The fleet had used it for 200 years. I felt it in my back teeth, and I took careful note of it. The delegation moved to the center of the parade ground. They stopped. The positioning was precise, equidistant from the cardinal points of the yard, maximizing visual access from every angle of approach. They knew they were being observed from multiple positions, and they had placed themselves to be observed from all of them equally. They deployed what I recognized from 26 days of communication study as a high-authority broadcast signal. I recognized the tonal signature. The way you recognize a raised voice in a language you're still learning. The shape of authority, even before the content. The signal translated said, "People of this world, we are the Vorathi Survey Fleet. Your planet has been cataloged within the Galactic Accord. You are invited to receive our terms." I was standing at the edge of the parade ground with Colonel Adami and about 40 other personnel, all of them watching the delegation with the kind of focus that comes from training plus the animal part of the brain that runs underneath training. Colonel Adami looked at me. He had been briefed, only loosely, about my communication work at the perimeter. His face was calm the way a surface is calm that has a lot happening beneath it. He said quietly, "Sergeant, they're telling us something. What are they saying?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Terms." "Yes, sir." "Not greetings, not we come in peace." "No, sir." He looked at the delegation for a long time. His face was doing nothing readable. His hands were clasped behind his back. The subsonic hum from the delegation suits was audible in the silence of the yard, and I watched him and I could see, in the set of his jaw, that he felt it. That it was doing what it was designed to do, and that he had decided it wasn't going to do what it was designed to do. "Okay," he said. It was the same word I had said 31 days ago when the first probe came down, standing in my split-heeled boot in the 3 in the morning dark. Well, here we are. I thought, "We come from the same planet, Colonel. We come from the same 400 million year elimination tournament. We're going to be fine." The next 72 hours are, by now, very well documented. There are 6 separate official accounts and at least 400 personal testimonies and 3 academic volumes that I personally find almost entirely wrong about the important parts. So let me tell you what actually happened from where I was standing. The Vorathi delegation delivered terms. The terms were, in the language Tethkadaris had helped me understand, what the fleet called a standard resource and labor accord. It had been delivered to 41 other species over 400 years. It had been accepted by 41 of them, some enthusiastically, most with varying degrees of reluctance. None had refused. The accord involved, among other things, A transfer of mineral extraction rights to Vorathi commercial entities, a population census for developmental capacity assessment, labor potential mapping, which I translated and explained to Colonel Adami, who said, in a very specific tone, the establishment of Vorathi administrative oversight presence in 3 geographic zones, and a permanent prohibition on the development of interstellar drive technology without Vorathi license. Colonel Adami listened to my translation. He asked several precise questions. I translated his questions. The delegation answered. I translated the answers. After 90 minutes of this, Colonel Adami said to me, "Tell them we need 3 days to consult with our leadership." I did. The delegation agreed. They withdrew to their ground unit. The ships in orbit did not move. On the walk back, the colonel said, "They think we're stalling." "Probably," I said. "We're not stalling," he said. "I know, sir." He said, 3 days is enough time to understand something well enough to find the door." I thought about the 14-unit deployment, the 72 hours that had told Tethkadaris everything she needed to know about the species. "Yes, sir," I said. "I need to tell you about what those 3 days looked like from the inside." The Vorathi delegation was using the consultation period to confirm what they already believed they knew. I know this because Tethkadaris told me later that Fleet Command had run probability analysis on the 3-day request and assigned a 92% likelihood to the interpretation that the humans were using the time to deliberate about the terms, weigh the alternatives, perhaps debate among their various governmental factions. The fleet's database on this species included extensive records of their political fragmentation, which the fleet had categorized as a structural weakness. And ultimately arrive at the same place every other species had arrived. The probability analysis was not wrong exactly. There were governments deliberating. There were factions arguing. There were emergency sessions of bodies that had never anticipated needing to convene for this particular purpose and were handling that with varying degrees of grace. All of that was happening. It was just not the only thing that was happening. What was also happening? In a signals intelligence facility in the American Southwest, a team that had been monitoring the Vorathi fleet's communication traffic since the ship's first appearance was, with 3 days of additional intercept time, developing a detailed map of the fleet's relay architecture. In a university in Germany, a xenolinguistics lab that had received copies of my tonal recordings through back channels I am still not fully authorized to discuss, was making its own translation progress. Slower than mine, but broader, and their vocabulary notes were better organized than my notebooks. In 3 separate military facilities on 3 separate continents, engineers were running reverse analysis on the probe's physical design, working from electromagnetic emission signatures and the handful of photographs that had been taken, trying to understand the manufacturing logic. In a research vessel currently positioned in the North Atlantic, an oceanographer who had been studying deep-sea pressure adaptation in cephalopods was writing a paper. At the request of a government she had not known had her contact information, about the relationship between environmental pressure, adaptive response, and cognitive architecture. This is the thing the fleet's probability analysis missed. It had modeled deliberation. It had not modeled the particular human tendency to use every available parallel track simultaneously, to be officially doing one thing and actually doing 6 things, because the organism that has survived by being too stubborn to stop does not, when given 3 days, spend 3 days thinking. It spends 3 days working. I need to tell you about Biscuit. On day 33, the second day of the 3-day consultation period, I went to the North Perimeter at 3:30, not for a communication session, just because it was where I went, and some things you do because the doing of them is itself the point. Biscuit didn't come that morning. He was getting worse. The Hendersons had told me he'd stopped eating 2 days ago, 11 years is old for a dog his size, and 11 years of living is a lot of living. I sat on the ground by myself and I thought about what I had learned over 33 days about communication, not the tonal language, the thing underneath the tonal language, the thing that existed between a robot and a dog, between a probe and a woman sitting in the pre-dawn dark, between a species that had survived every extinction their planet could throw at them and another species that had, across 4 centuries, never once had to survive anything. The Vorathi were capable. Nobody was questioning that. Their technology was centuries beyond anything we had. Their institutional knowledge, their material science, their medical capabilities, their computational systems, all of it was overwhelming in comparison to anything on Earth's best day. But they had never been hungry, not in the way the fossil record meant. Not in the way that gets into your genome and sits there for 200,000 years and makes your children's children's children wake up at 3 in the morning with a low-grade threat assessment running in the back of their heads that never fully shuts off. The Vorathi had surveyed 1,236 worlds. They had found 62 species capable of communication. Of those 62, every single one had signed the accord. I thought, they think that's the sample size that matters. I thought, they're wrong about what the data means. The door, Colonel Adami had said. 3 days is enough time to understand something well enough to find the door. What followed is documented better than I can do justice to, so I'll give you the version that happened in the room where I was translating. The delegation returned on day 36 for the response. They arrived with additional personnel. They had also, I noticed, repositioned 2 of the 3 orbital ships to a lower and more visible orbit, a subtle escalation that I translated for Colonel Adami before we entered the room, and that he noted without expression. The Accord delegation's lead representative, a figure whose rank markers I had learned to read, began the session with what I recognized as a soft power speech. The benefits of Accord membership, the development assistance available to new species, the protections offered by Accord status. It was well delivered. I could see, from a structural standpoint, exactly what it was designed to do, to make the alternative feel worse than the choice. Colonel Adami waited until the speech was complete. He sat with his hands folded on the table. He said, "We appreciate the offer. We have some questions." I translated. The lead representative invited the questions with a gesture I had come to understand as generous tolerance. The questions were not what the delegation expected. They were not about the Accord's terms, not about the mineral rights or the population census or the administrative zones. They were about the fleet itself, the ship's drive systems, emission profile, fuel cycle, maintenance intervals, the communication relay network, frequency architecture, encryption methodology, the physical location of primary nodes, the survey fleet's command hierarchy, which decisions required fleet command authorization and which could be made at the surveyor level, the Accord's historical precedents, which species had signed under what conditions, and what had happened to those species in the 50 years following signature. I translated each question carefully. The delegation answered, I could see, with a growing awareness that the answers were being heard differently than intended, that the question asker was not intimidated, that the 90 minutes of the first meeting and the 3 days of the consultation period had not been used to deliberate about whether to sign. They had been used to learn the drive system emission profile, the communication node locations, the command hierarchy vulnerabilities, and the full 50-year post-signature history of every species that had ever gone before us. After the 4th question, the lead representative paused and spoke to a subordinate. The subordinate looked at me. I looked back. The lead representative then said something I will remember for the rest of my life. He said it in Vorathi tonal language, which he had not expected me to understand, in what I believe was meant to be an aside to his subordinate. He said, "How long have they known our language?" I answered him directly, in Vorathi. I said 26 days. The silence in that room was a very specific kind of silence. The kind you get when someone recalibrates, when something they had filed as known becomes suddenly unknown again. I said, we are not refusing the accord. He was very still. We are proposing amendments. Tethkadaris, I learned later, had watched the meeting through the unit's relay. She had been relieved of her survey duties following her unauthorized reclassification of the planet's hazard status and was technically confined to quarters pending review. She watched anyway. She wrote in her log that evening. The administration looked at the data and saw a pre-spaceflight species with conventional weapons. They looked at the extinction record and saw the past. I looked at the same extinction record and saw what survived it. This species does not experience overwhelming force as a signal to surrender. They experience it as information. They catalog it. They look for the door. They found the door. I do not know if the Accord will accept the amendments. I do not know if this will become a diplomatic relationship or a conflict. What I know is this: every species the Accord has ever contacted was changed by the contact. Usually they became smaller, more managed, more knowable. This species will change the contact. I am certain of it. I changed the classification because I could see it. I have been in this work for 30 years, and I could see it the way you see a weight before it falls. The administration said I was overcautious. They said severe was reserved for species that posed active threat potential. I have spent 40 days observing a pre-spaceflight species that was born from an unbroken chain of extinction events, and never once allowed extinction to be the answer. I do not know what they are going to be in 100 years. I know what they are not going to be. They are not going to be small. The amendments were 27 pages long. I am not going to take you through all 27 pages, but I want to tell you about page 1 because page 1 was mine. Colonel Adami had given me 48 hours to draft the first page. He said, "You've been talking to them longer than anyone. You understand what they need to hear. What do we need to lead with?" I spent a long time with that question. I thought about Biscuit, who died on day 34 in the Henderson family's quarters with Mrs. Henderson's hand on his back. I thought about what it meant that the probe had learned his specific sound, had made a dedicated acoustic signature for a golden retriever who was not the species it was designed to contact, who was not a communication partner in any technical sense, who was just there, present, deserving of acknowledgement. I thought about what it meant that I had cried a little those mornings, not from fear, from the recognition of being seen. I wrote, "We note that the Vorathi survey fleet's existing Accord framework was developed over 400 years of contact with 62 species, none of whom occupied a Death World-adjacent biosphere above the moderate classification tier. We are proposing amendments not because we reject partnership, we welcome it, but because the existing framework was not designed with us in mind. Not our history, not our biology, not our specific and complicated relationship with survival. We are not asking to be treated as exceptional. We are asking to be treated as ourselves. We are asking for a framework that acknowledges that what looks, from the outside, like stubbornness or aggression or unreasonable persistence is, from the inside, simply the thing that kept us here. We are still here. We want to work with you. We want to understand your civilization and share what we know of ours. We want to send people to your worlds and receive yours here. We want to build something that neither of us could build alone. We are asking only that you understand before we begin that the warning in your own system, the one that said Death World adjacent, the one filed under moderate, the one nobody read, was underselling it. We are not asking you to be afraid of us. We are asking you to see us clearly. The Accord was renegotiated. It took 4 years. It is, By all accounts from the Vorathi diplomatic corps, the most exhausting diplomatic process in the history of the Galactic Accord, and they have been having diplomatic processes for 400 years. The negotiations moved through 17 separate venues, involved 412 official sessions, and an uncountable number of unofficial ones, produced 6 separate near collapses that were each resolved through means the Accord's formal diplomatic protocol had no framework for handling, and concluded with an agreement that a senior Accord legal analyst later described, in a document I was allowed to read but not keep, as structurally unprecedented and probably unenforceable, but unusually, something both parties appear to actually want to honor. The amendments were not all accepted, some were. The mineral extraction rights were significantly restructured. Humanity retained subsurface sovereignty. The Accord received negotiated commercial access to specific non-critical deposits, and a joint oversight committee was established with actual enforcement mechanisms, which was apparently the first time the Accord had ever agreed to a joint oversight committee with actual enforcement mechanisms. The population census never happened and was formally struck from the Accord's standing contact protocols for all species, a change that affected the approach to 11 other member species who had been quietly unhappy about it for decades. The administrative zones were replaced by a mutual observer program. We send people to their worlds, they send observers to ours. Nobody administers anyone. The interstellar drive prohibition was dropped entirely. It was not negotiated away. It was not exchanged for something else. It was dropped at the Accord delegation's initiative on day 12 of the formal negotiations, when it became apparent, through a demonstration that I was not present for but was described to me in considerable detail by a colleague who was, that the engineering teams that had been working from probe emission signatures had already produced a theoretical framework for the drive architecture that was, in the opinion of the Accord's own engineers, functional, not refined, not production-ready, but functional. The prohibition was dropped because prohibiting something that someone has already half-invented is an agreement about paperwork, not about reality, and the Accord, whatever its institutional flaws, was practical. We built our first drive in 11 years. The Vorathi had expected it to take 80. Tethkadaris, restored to her surveyor position after the Accord renegotiation, the severity reclassification officially upheld and formally incorporated into the contact registry's criteria for the severe tier, which was expanded and clarified to specifically include multi-extinction pressure biospheres, sent me a message when the first human vessel completed its maiden voyage. It came through in Vorathi tonal language. I could read it fluently by then, which still surprises me when I think about it. Not because the language is easy, it isn't, but because fluency in a thing you learned under those conditions, in those notebooks, in that clay, carries a different weight than fluency acquired in a classroom. You learn differently when the stakes are real. She wrote, "The administration asked me what I thought when I first watched you approach the probe." I wrote back, "What did you say?" She wrote, "I said I thought, this species has decided we are something worth paying attention to, not something to worship, not something to flee. Worth paying attention to." I wrote, "Is that a good thing?" She wrote, after a pause that lasted long enough that I was not certain she was going to respond, "We have contacted 1,241 worlds. I have surveyed 40 of them. I have never sent an urgent communication to Fleet Command before. In 40 years of survey work, I have never changed a classification without authorization. I have never been relieved of duty. I have never watched a contact unfold in a way that I could not fit into the models I was trained on. I waited." She wrote, "I am glad I did, all of it, including the parts that got me confined to quarters." I wrote back, "The best things usually cost something." Another pause. She wrote, "You people are going to be very interesting to know." I thought about that for a while. I wrote, "We're going to try. I'm going to finish where I started. with the split-heeled boot, with the Georgia clay, with 3 in the morning and a device the size of a dinner plate coming down out of a sky full of lights like it had been placed there by a very careful hand. I did not run. I want to be clear about that still all these years later, not because I was brave, because I had grown up on a world that taught me, through every biological and historical mechanism it had available, that the thing in front of you that looks like it might be the end of you is usually not the end. Usually it is information. Usually, if you stand still long enough and pay enough attention, you can find the door. We are from a world that tried to kill us continuously for 400 million years and kept failing. We carry that in our bones. We carry it in the way we wake up at 3 in the morning already assessing, in the way we approach strange machines with our hands open, in the way we sit beside old dogs in the dark and find that enough. The Vorathi filed us as Death World adjacent, moderate, because the language they had for what we are was not quite the right language. They had no word, in any of their 46,000 translated dialects, for a species that had earned its survival not through power or size or technological advantage, but through the particular and stubborn refusal to let extinction be the last word. They have one now, they borrowed it from us. They call it perseverance. Biscuit is buried at the north end of the base. Someone planted a rose bush. It comes back every year. I still go there at 3:30 sometimes, not for any reason, just because some things you do because the doing of them is itself the point, and some things that are worth anything take time, and some connections are made not in the language you share but in the silence between words, which is where the important parts live. We are still here. We are going to keep being here. The universe is very large and very old, and it has been trying to end us, one way or another, for as long as we've existed. We're still taking notes.